Well, I wonder what you say to people who talk about social justice, because capitalism would have meant that people were deprived of being able to do what they wanted. About social justice.
Social justice, it's an interesting term coming out of the Catholic Church in the 19th century, really to combat capitalism. It was a way to attack capitalism. And the idea here that justice is about the group. Justice is about sameness in some sense. Justice is about some form of equality or nobody suffering. So if somebody's suffering over here, the social just answer is let's take some people over here and give it to them so that they're better off, so that they don't suffer. I think it's a contradiction in terms. I don't think that's justice. I don't think it's just to take from some and gives to others by force. I think force is, the opposite of justice, forcing people to behave in ways that they do not perceive, whether they're right or wrong, that they don't perceive as in their self-interest is evil. It is wrong. The whole point of the establishment of this country was to eradicate force from human interaction. It's to have people free from force. And it's interesting because the founders also understood that the one entity that violated individual rights the most in all of human history and used force the most in all of human history was government. That's why we have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights, to try to prevent government from infringing on our rights. It's not the way they view the Bill of Rights and the Constitution today, but that's its purpose, to protect us from them. That's the purpose of the Constitution, to limit government, to limit their role, limit their job. So the whole concept of social justice, I think, is a contradiction in terms. I think justice is an individual concept. I could be unjust to you by treating you in a way that you don't deserve. Justice is about desert. It's about what you deserve, what you've earned, what you haven't earned. And justice can only occur, in that kind of voluntary market. And the only place of government's role in terms of justice is there in the criminal justice sense. Right? It's to arbitrate disputes, and then it's to step in when there's some thug out there who's using force or fraud and put them in jail. And that's just because that person who's using force or fraud is treating you not the way you deserve. You don't deserve to be punched in the nose. And it's the role of government to extract that person so that they can't treat you all unjustly. But there's no such thing as group justice, social justice. We have to get away from the collectivistic terms that have been ingrained in us for decades now. It's all about groups and society. Society is nothing but a collection of individuals. And then it's a question, is it individual justice? Is it just to force this guy to support that guy when he doesn't want to? If he wants to, then he can do it voluntarily. There's nothing wrong with charity. There's nothing wrong with helping people. That's fine. But the government doesn't ask you to help. It forces you to help. When people go to the government because they need health care, they're not asking the government to organize a charity, which the government shouldn't do anyway, but they're not asking them to organize a charity. They're asking them to use force to take from somebody else. That's unjust. And the whole concept of social justice is a contradiction. Yes?
This might not be exactly in our point
What?
tonight, but curious to your thoughts on hyperinflation with everything that's going on in the economy right now. What are the odds of that happening in the future, and what might be some tipping point to get us there?
So hyperinflation, macroeconomic prediction is a fool's game, but it's never stopped me, I guess. Look, hyperinflation is clearly a possibility. The Federal Reserve has increased the money supply dramatically, the money it's created, in a sense, dramatically over the last 2 years. By well over $1 trillion of new money that it's created. When does that $1 trillion turn into inflation? And I'm not even sure what you mean by hyperinflation, just significant inflation. When does that? It's a little complicated, but the way it becomes inflation is when it starts circulating in the economy. In other words, when banks start lending it out. When it starts going around and starts being exchanged. Every dollar the Fed creates, because of the way our banking system is constructed, fractional reserve banking, $9 are created on top of that dollar, right? So $1 trillion suddenly become $9 trillion, and that's where you get hyperinflation. Why don't we have hyperinflation right now? Because the banks are not lending money. Of course, everybody in government wants them to lend money, but of course they don't really. They just say that because it sounds good. But when you ask the bankers, why aren't you lending money, they'll tell you that the regulators won't let them. Plus, the economy's slow, and there are not a lot of good credits out there, right? There are not a lot of good people, and a lot of people don't want to borrow money because they don't want to grow their businesses. Why don't they want to grow their businesses? Because they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, what the tax rates, what the regulations are going to be tomorrow, and what the economy is going to be like. So there's no demand for loans right now. But imagine that somehow you flip the switch tomorrow, and everybody wanted to go out and borrow money, and they could. The banks would lend them. Then you would have hyperinflation. Now, what Bernanke's trick is, what he's trying to do, is he's going to wait until this starts picking up, bank lending starts picking up, and he'll start pulling the money out of the economy to try to prevent it. Nobody's ever pulled this trick off. And the danger is it could go into hyperinflation or high inflation. I'm not sure what hyper means. Or we could get another recession, because if he sucks the money too fast out of the economy and the bankers go, oh, wait a minute, we shouldn't lend, and they stop lending, all of a sudden then you get a double dip. So what exactly happens, how it plays out, is, I think, impossible to tell. All I can tell you is it ain't good. Either way it goes, and I don't think you can do it perfectly. You know, this goes back to Hayek's view that you cannot have a central plan. There are just too many variables. It's impossible to do. We're talking about human choices. No computer, no human being ever will ever be able to integrate all those facts, because we change our minds as individuals, right? Computers can't forecast that. You can't do it. What Bernanke's trying to do, what Greenspan tried to do, is central plan. It's impossible. It always messes up. There's no right interest rate. There's no right supply of money. Only the market can determine that. And, of course, we don't have a market in interest. We don't have a market in money that's monopolized by the Federal Reserve.
I'm actually glad you said that. My question was going to be, we all know that the interest rate coordinates production across time, of course.
Yes.
And when you've got a central bank that's regulating that and artificially changing interest rates, you've got, a fundamental mismatch between supply and demand.
Yes.
That said, though, given all of those variables you can't practically account for, what is, in your opinion, the perfect middle ground between having what we have now and the volatility that's going to exist in the complete absence of a central bank?
Well, you're making an assumption I'm not accepting. The volatility that would exist without a central bank, I don't believe that's true.
You don't think so?
But let me first concretize what you just said. So you said, with the Federal Reserve is trying to set a price. And if it sets it too low, then that's bad. We know, for example, if you set the price of iPhones, if the government said, we're gonna control the price of iPhones, and if they set it too low, what'll happen? Everybody will want it, and Apple has no incentive to produce it, so you get enormous shortages of iPhones. The Soviets tried to do this with bread, right? And Nixon tried to do this with oil, right? And every scheme of price control has always failed. And if you set it too high, what happens? Everybody wants to make it. Apple wants to make lots of iPhones. None of us want to buy it because it's too high. So you get surpluses, right? Price controls have never, ever, 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 ever worked in all of human history. And yet, we've got 12 guys, one girl usually, they used to have, I think it's Yellen right now. 12 guys sitting around a boardroom every month, and they decide what the most important price in the entire U.S. economy, which is interest rates. There's no more important price, because every other price, including the price of the iPhone, is ultimately a consequence of what that interest rate is. Because if you understand it, that's the price to borrow money, that's the price they use to discount future cash flows, it's a price we evaluate everything with. That price we give to the government to control. That price we say it's okay, and surprise, they get it wrong. Now, I would argue that no matter what they do, they always get it wrong, because prices can only be determined by supply and demand in the marketplace. Since the Federal Reserve has no supply and demand curves, there is no signals of supply and demand, any price they do is wrong. They can't get it right, because the price that they pay affects our behavior, which sends a bad... So it messes up the economy all the time. The solution is no Federal Reserve. No Fed. We had...
I'll agree with that.
We had no Fed before 1914. Yes, there was some volatility. Most of that volatility can be explained by silly behavior from Washington and a lot of bad bank regulations at the state level. But there's absolutely no reason to believe that the private banking system would be any more volatile than any other private system. Yes, I mean, there's going to be some volatility, just like there's some volatility in technology and in steel and in anything else. But if you get a gold standard, whatever the standard happens to be, the market would determine it. There's no reason to assume that that volatility would be great. And indeed, the volatility since the existence of the Fed is far greater than before the existence of the Fed. You couldn't get a Great Depression without a Federal Reserve. You couldn't get what we had now without the Federal Reserve. You can get smaller stuff. You can get distortions. You can get recessions. But you're not going to get... They talk about systemic risk. Nobody has more systemic risk than the Federal Reserve. So what's the solution? Make them the systemic risk regulator. They're the systemic risk creator. How can they regulate systemic risk? They can't. So the solution is free banking, creating a legal structure to make that possible, figuring out what the standard should be, which is not self-evident, but what the market would determine the standard. The transition will be painful, but the outcome is much healthier than what we have today, and I believe less volatile. You don't get inflation with no central bank, so you wouldn't have had the 70s.
Exactly. Thank you.